yes, I want to request all of us to, if possible, kindly open up your face so that we can be able to see you. This will make us able to commune with you on a one-on-one, and the presenter will also feel very much at home when he gets to see the people that she's seeing, rather than just the names. So thank you so very much. And I want to pass it on now to Professor Sarah Banks. Welcome. In Kenya, we say, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Durham. I think I met you many years ago first at a conference. I think maybe it was it in Adelaide, Australia? I can't remember where, but or else. But the theme is rethinking community development, looking at ethical issues and challenges in community development work. And it's a workshop. I'm going to start with a presentation for about 30 minutes to give the background. And then we'll do some work looking at some vignettes about ethical challenges. And if you stick with me, you're still here later on, then we might split up into breakout groups and do some small group discussion on a vignette and maybe sharing some of your own ethical challenges. But I appreciate for many of you, it's been a long day. It's interesting to see the people from North America now are moving in. I think the Australians have probably gone to bed now. So great to see you all. So I'll start off by sharing my screen. That's good. Okay, so here's the presentation, and you'll see it's called Rethinking Community Development as the preface. We'd hoped that we would have a second presentation on the theme of rethinking, but sadly our Australian presenters couldn't make it, so I'm the only one on that theme. And to talk to you about this theme because we have a book series of which I'm the co-editor called Rethinking Community Development. And I think you probably all got a message yesterday to say, want a discounted book just available during the course of the conference, then you can go onto the website and book one. There's a variety of titles and we're interested in more titles. So if any of you are interested in editing a book on a theme related to community development, please get in touch. The one that I'm focusing on today most of all is the Ethics, Equity and Community Development book, the green one in the middle there. I'd like to draw your attention to the one next to it, Populism and Community Development, which would have been talked about tomorrow by Sue Kenny and colleagues, but sadly isn't. But that is a great book and I would commend it to you. And just about to come out, Arts, Culture and Community Development, and that will be coming out in July. So that's just the sales pitch for the books. Academic books are incredibly expensive these days, particularly the ones produced in the UK. So even 50% discount, it's still expensive, but it's better than paying 100%. So there we go. An overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about this theme of rethinking community development and rethinking community development ethics. I'll talk about community development work as an ethical practice and the advantages of a focus on ethics and the dangers of a focus on ethics, and propose what I'll call an alternative model of ethics, which links very nicely to the theme of Ubuntu and African philosophy that we've heard about earlier on today. And I'll offer a threefold framework for thinking about ethical practice and end with looking at the importance of focusing on ethics in community development work. And then we'll get a chance to have some discussion with some vignettes and examples from practice. So the rethinking community development theme, I think we've already had a good introduction to that from many of the speakers. We need to rethink what is community development in these very challenging times, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but the growing climate crisis, the growth of populism, the renewed identity and rights-based protests, Black Lives Matter, the continuing and new political conflicts that are happening all over the world, and the continuing, not only in the global north, I think these are happening across the world. So there's a lot for us to think about. And what about rethinking ethics? What I'd like to do is invite you to reimagine what we mean by ethics. responding particularly to skepticism and suspicion about ethics in community development. I'm not sure if you're aware of all the literature, but for a long time there has been a skepticism about the value of ethics. And also the importance of revisiting and recalibrating, weighing up community development values and challenging what we're often faced with as a crude utilitarianism where the ends justify the means, the growth of fake news where we don't know what is true and what is not, and the general acceptance of the status quo. So we need to relook, revisit, and strengthen actually the community development values. So before I go any further, I should say what I think of as ethics. There's many definitions of ethics, but what I'd like to introduce you to is my view that ethics is a topic that covers questions about what actions are right and wrong, what qualities of character people should develop, what kind of lives people should lead, what counts as a good society, what responsibilities humans have for each other and the ecosystem. So that's my take on ethics. So it's a very inclusive view of ethics. And I think it's important that we make visible the ethical dimensions of community development work. So if ethics is about matters of benefits, harms, rights and responsibilities of humans to each other and the ecosystem, then obviously ethical issues are always present in community development work. And they're present in the coverage of the values through our commitment to social justice, human rights, collective action. They're present in the practice, where we have to think about how to mobilize people without exploiting them, how to encourage participation inclusively, and in the politics of community development. How do we identify and relate to power holders? How do we challenge government structures? So I believe that ethics is always there. And particularly when we think about ethics, we're often thinking about dilemmas or challenges. And these are just a few of the challenges that I think are there. And you may actually note other challenges. And we've already heard about some of these earlier today, although they may not have been couched in terms of ethics. So negotiating rights, needs and interests of different communities, groups and individuals. So communities aren't always homogenous, as we all know. Balancing a desire to achieve social change, good ends, against ensuring a democratic process, the means. So having an inclusive process for our good ends. Mediating between employer demands and community participation. Maintaining vigilance to identify and challenge injustices and counteract co-option by the state or private corporations, and deciding on tactics that both are effective and egalitarian. So those are just some of the challenges I think that community development workers face every day in the small parts of their practice, not just when they're facing a big decision, a life-threatening decision. So community development is fundamentally an ethical practice. Like other social professions, it's premised on values relating to safeguarding and promoting people's dignity, worth, human rights, and well-being or welfare, and the fair distribution of social goods, equity, and social justice. Yet, I think little attention has been paid to ethics per se in community development work. It's not to say those issues aren't talked about all the time. They are, but we don't often highlight them as being ethical. When I was looking to edit the book on the right there, I was looking to see what other books are there on ethics in community development work, and I really didn't find very many. I'd be very interested if you know some in languages other than English, which obviously I'm not aware, would not be aware of. But I think it's a rather neglected topic. Why are the ethical issues not named as ethical and discussed more in community development work? You may disagree with me. You may think that they are. So I will be interested to hear from you. And I think it's because some community development workers may be suspicious of ethics. They may associate ethics with professionalization and codes of ethics. So they're prescriptive and top-down, Western and colonial, that these codes are imposed upon community development workers who quite often don't necessarily want to take on the identity of a distant professional. They're not like doctors or lawyers. They are closer to people. They're allies of people. Do they want to take on this professionalism? Now, that's been an ongoing debate. It's interesting that in the International Association for Community Development, the idea of community development as a profession and a discipline is now accepted and promoted, but it is an ongoing debate. We may associate ethics with individuals making difficult choices, this idea of dilemmas, which is individualistic. It's, I have a problem, I have to solve the dilemma. And often these are abstracted from context. We don't locate them in the places, countries, cultures where they're happening. And above all, I think for community development workers, often ethics is seen as a distraction from the political side of the work and from the analysis of power structures. So there may be an issue here about how we view politics and ethics, and maybe we need to see them as more connected. So what are some of the advantages of looking at issues as ethical in community development work? Well, we can highlight the role of community development workers as ethical agents, that is, people who have a responsibility to reflect carefully on roles and responsibilities in relation to harms, benefits, and rights, and to put into practice community development values. And this is particularly important in the COVID crisis and in the climate of neoliberal managerialized services, more repressive state control, and often reduced funding for community development work and for the people that community development workers work alongside. Secondly, we can draw on the rich literature of philosophical ethics, that is, moral philosophy, including ethical traditions from across the world. And I've just put a couple up there about Chinese ethics and African ethics, both of which are much more communal, communitarian than the Western individualistic and abstract tradition. So they may offer alternative paradigms with less focus on codes and individual choices. And we heard some very nice accounts of the philosophy of Ubuntu earlier on today. But what are the dangers of a focus on ethics? Western ethics is often linked with individuals facing dilemmas, the focus on decision making. If we regard individual workers as ethical agents, this may contribute to shifting attention away from structural forces that create inequality and injustice. So we don't want to see the problem of distributing scarce resources as lying with the community development worker. The problem is created by the society in which they are operating. It may result in individual workers being regarded as more responsible than they should be for tackling issues outside their control and feeling shame, regret, moral distress. And ethics is often associated with morality, which is the prevailing social norms, which was regarded by Karl Marx as a bourgeois illusion, encouraging individual responsibility, conformity, and the illusion of free choice. So linked with this idea of governmentality, that if I think I have a choice and it's my responsibility to help people who are experiencing homelessness, poverty, drug addiction, etc., then I'm going to take on board my failure, and I'm going to not perhaps challenge the bigger structural issues. So it's important to not to take too much of that responsibility, while for problems that are not of our making, while at the same time taking some responsibility for collective action to try to work together with others to change the issues. So in response to these critiques, I think we need an alternative conception of ethics to what I see as the dominant Western conception that you find often in the textbooks. And many of you will be, if you're teaching in universities or you studied in universities, may have been doing it within a social work context. And often it's the social work textbooks that come from USA or UK or wherever else, which have a more Western version of ethics within them. And I think we need a version of ethics that's neither individualized nor decontextualized. We need to see people's ethical agency as relational and situated in practical and political context. So it's situated, that means it's embodied in particular people. So I am hopefully a person who is trustworthy, reliable, honest, that is my characteristic, and embedded in specific contexts where I happen to be working in Durham, northeast of England, in the UK. And so here we would look more to theories of virtue, ethics, that is qualities of character, and situated ethics. And the idea of relationality, very much stressed earlier on today by the plenary speakers, individuals as mutually dependent and exercising what we might call relational autonomy. So my self-determination, my choices are only possible in the context of support or hindrance from other people. And an ethics of care, which values relationships, and communitarian ethics are very important. So I'd like to stress the importance of what I call everyday ethics, which is about what kinds of people we are, how we respond to others on a daily basis, so how we look at people, talk to people, consider people, and it's about emotions as well as reason. So often we think of ethics as about making these difficult decisions based on abstract ethical reasoning, weighing up pros and cons, but actually we could be thinking more about, well, what kind of person am I? How can I be compassionate in this situation? How can I maintain the dignity of this people or this community? So this conception of ethics is very important to challenge the textbook version of ethics in many countries, but not all. Recently, I did some research with an international group through the International Federation of Social Workers on ethical challenges in social work during COVID-19. And looking at the kind of challenges people were facing and the ways they were responding, we came up with a threefold framework for thinking about ethical practice and for looking at what people were doing. And obviously in pandemic conditions, people need to be more vigilant, to look for the ethical issues in a situation. What might we be missing? Because there's new risks, new restrictions. We're faced with a situation that is not usual for us. So who is being harmed? What are the risks? We have to reassess them. The community development worker herself or himself becomes a risk if they may be spreading the virus, for example, which in the past wouldn't have been the case. Ethical reasoning, which we're used to, that's what we think about when we think about ethics. What are the pros and cons of alternative courses of action? What is right in this situation? But we may have to rethink that situation as some of the principles and values related to health, well-being may have to come higher than those about autonomy and choice, for example. And finally, what we called ethical logistics. We often talk about logistics in terms of strategy and planning and getting things into the right place, but how can we carry out the right action? So it's all very well to decide what is the right thing to do, but how do we do it? What strategies and efforts are needed to mobilize people and resources and handle risks? And again, in pandemic or other emergency and crisis conditions, there's many more things to think about. You know, you've got to think about whether you can get the right protective equipment, as a very small example. So just elaborating briefly upon these, ethical vigilance is about being alert and sensitive to the ethical dimensions of practice. And this encapsulates moral perception, that is the capacity to notice and foreground ethical issues that may be hidden, and to see situations from several different perspectives. And it's also important to be aware of our own tendency to rush, particularly in an emergency, and to see if we can hold back and look carefully. So the kind of questions we might ask are about what are the ethical issues, who's benefiting, who's harmed, who's responsible for what to whom, what needs, interests, rights, structural constraints are in place. Are there unusual ethical issues, for example, COVID-19, inter-community conflict, whatever that might be? Is there a danger of reacting too quickly? So that's ethical vigilance, being more alert. Ethical reasoning, which, as I said, is what we often think about when we think about ethics, how to balance different needs, rights, responsibilities, weigh up harms and benefits, judge what is the right approach, and justify our decisions. And for example, during COVID-19, due to new risks, reduced services, more weight may be placed on public good, safety, and minimizing health risks than in so-called normal circumstances. Although those of you who are from countries where you're used to epidemics and pandemics, you would also be used to some of these weighing up of different kinds of risks. So the practice of slow ethical reasoning is more important as a process of rethinking and recalibrating values has to take place. So we can ask ourselves questions about what is the right approach, what reasons and arguments might we use, and bearing in mind constraints and risks, how do we balance rights and responsibilities of all parties? And ethical logistics, working strategically and practically to act on our ethical judgments and decisions, whilst promoting people's welfare and respecting their dignity and rights as far as possible in order to achieve social change. This involves complex and time-consuming processes, including making efforts to resist unfair or unnecessary constraints and find creative solutions to resource shortages. And questions we might ask ourselves include, how can we carry out the right course of action? And in the context of these constraints, what creative strategies and new resources are needed? And often this seems like a jigsaw puzzle. We have to put the right pieces together in the right place at the right time. So to conclude the presentation, it's important to make visible what I call the microethics of everyday practice, the things we're doing on an everyday basis. They're not matters of life or death or losing your funding, but they're how we treat people, how we respond in small ways. It's also important to put the ethical issues in a political context and to regard acting ethically also as a political act, that politics has an ethical component. And a philosopher, sociologist, Simon Critchley, talked about this: if ethics without politics is empty, then politics without ethics is blind. So that interrelationship between politics and ethics, which the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle was very clear about. And so I think was one of our community development heroes, Paulo Freire, who in one of his later books, The Pedagogy of Indignation, said that to him, political struggle should be undertaken in the name of ethics, not obviously the ethics of the markets, but rather the universal ethics of human beings, in the name of the needed transformation of society that should result in overcoming dehumanizing injustice. So here's a plea to put ethics onto the map. If any of you are interested in some of the work we've been doing at Durham University in the UK, we have a Centre for Social Justice and Community Action, and we're particularly interested in doing community-based participatory research. We've developed some materials on ethics, so you can look at those on that website. I'd like to repeat the discount and the code for the book series. And I have a final plug to make for any of you who are interested in ethical issues and might have some material to share. We're doing a special issue of the Community Development Journal. Pradeep Narayanan from India and Linda Chevalier from Australia are working with me on a special issue, and we're calling for abstracts, and we could publish full articles or case studies. So if any of you have any case studies of ethical issues, then I would love to invite you to join us in that. And what I'm going to do now is stop and ask if there's any questions or comments on the presentation, and we'll just have about 10 minutes for any questions or comments. And then we'll move into the workshop phase where we will look at some vignettes. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing now and see if there are any questions or comments. And I think it's a small enough group, isn't it, that you can you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand either physically or by using the hand raising function. think Stuart's iPad has got a question or a comment. Hello, Stuart.
Well, hi, Sarah. Thank you for that. I enjoyed that. But you refer to values and ethics. And I remember being told once, and I just wondered if it struck with me that our ethics in community development were the expression of our values. So I just wanted you to say a bit more about, is there a distinction between the values of practice and the value base that we operate out of in ethics, or do you see them as a practical expression of values?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. Often we talk about values as ethical principles, and those values which are about social justice, respect for dignity, promoting human rights, collective action, which are the key values of community development. The ethics is then how we put them into practice. And some of those ethical principles or values make conflict in some situations, and we have to then make decisions. Do we prioritize somebody's dignity, or do we prioritize somebody's health or whatever? So absolutely, I totally agree there.
I just wanted to comment and say thank you, Sarah. I found that really helpful. I thought the framing of everyday ethics was eminently practical, understandable, jargon-free, and something that's really helpful in terms of application. I'm working from a perspective of looking at the intersection of theology and community development practices. So I just find it particularly interesting because we're looking at how Christian ethics and community development are in conflict, that are problem-sized and are beneficial to one another, and trying to create a space where there's an understanding of the way that faith infuses an ethical approach to practice, and those spaces where actually there are clashes and it needs problematizing and contextualizing and deconstructing. So not really a question, but just a comment, and just find it really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's another challenge which I didn't put on my list, and could add, you know, the sort of the clash between personal, professional, religious, political values, which is a constant issue for all community development workers, I think. Yeah, thank you for that.
I see. And Sarah, perhaps you also need to consider, you know, this issue about the culture of a people. The culture of a people, to a great extent, can be a big source of conflict, you know, with the ethical principles that a CD practitioner may choose to really uphold. So in some situations, you get to see that what people find as a culture goes contrary to the ethics that an individual who is practicing community development to engage or to advance. And I think that's a big challenge, especially for many of us who are practicing in the African context.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a very important issue as well, isn't it? And this is where the idea of sort of to what extent are we professionals with professional standards and values, yet we're located in a context and a locality amongst people who've got particular values. And often the community development worker has taken on values from both sources and then has to work out how best to act. So I think that is a really important issue. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. My name is Mairead from Ireland. I often find myself in a space of confusion, I guess, really around ethics, and trying to get my head around a position. Maybe if we take, you know, COVID, for example, we saw movements that might have been anti-mask, anti-vax, you know, that kind of thing, and trying to respect people's freedom of expression, their own opinion. And then the challenge of, you know, the public health and information versus misinformation and opinion and fact, and, you know, everything that comes in between that. And in my own personal and professional space, I've been challenged by people going, well, you always want to do what you think is right, which is connected, you know, to what Stuart was saying initially, in and around our community development values. And how do we make sure, I guess, that we're not imposing what we feel is right, you know, as a professional on communities, and respect our individuals or communities, and respecting that it's a really complicated statement, sorry, Sarah, but if you know what I mean, I find it such a challenge to how far do you go, you know, in, you know, trying to look for change without imposing your position on somebody.
Yeah, and I think that links to Judraf's comment earlier, doesn't it? And that's where I suppose, you know, our professional judgment comes in, doesn't it? That we have to weigh up. And there's certain things that you can't let go if there's racism, injustice, sexism that one has to challenge and say, well, these are the values that I hold and I'm going to challenge you. But in other cases, you may have to back off and be gentler and work slowly. And I guess for all community development workers, we know it's a long process, don't we? And the change and the educational process takes time, but it is a kind of fine judgment. And I think even though we know it's a long process, often we're funded for a short amount of time, and so one's tempted to push things harder and further, and perhaps to take more of a lead and impose one's own values. But we also know that doesn't necessarily work. So I think you've highlighted a really challenging issue for community development workers. Yeah. Anything else that anybody would like to say before we move on? Well, I see we've got 27 people, 1 or 2 I think are tech support. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen again and just look at 1 or 2 vignettes, and then we'll move into small groups. Okay, so I mentioned the fact of everyday ethics, so very small issues that are coming up every day. And I've got a couple of vignettes which are from COVID-19 experiences across the world. And the first one comes from Italy, where a community development worker was employed by a drug and alcohol service, an NGO, to run self-help groups. And during the first COVID-19 lockdown, the service closed its offices and meeting rooms, and the community development worker set up a WhatsApp group to maintain contact with the people who could not access the service, and to propose some mutual support activities. This activity wasn't recognised by the manager, who asked the community development worker to close the WhatsApp group. The worker did not do this. Was this decision ethical, unethical? It depends on whatever it depends on. I'd like you just to think very quickly. I was talking about slow ethics and taking time, but this is an exercise, right? So this exercise is about fast thinking as a way of starting a discussion. So I'd like you to just think, do you think it was ethical, unethical, or it depends? And normally, if I was in control, I would do a poll, but I can't do a poll now. But I can actually put that into the chat just so you can be looking at. So just be thinking about that.
Sarah, can I clarify? Are you asking whether the decision to start the group or not close it when the manager told them to?
Yeah, good question. Decision? Yeah, to not close it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, was a decision of the worker. I should amend that. So thank you for that point. Yeah, so I've popped it into the chat. And if you do it with a poll, because you can do this with students or whatever, it's better to do it with a poll, because then it's anonymous. People vote before they see other people's hands or whatever. But in this group, we'll just, I'll do it by asking you. And I think you can either raise your hand or pop into the chat. So how many of you think it was ethical of the worker not to close the WhatsApp group? So if you'd just like to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, we've got one person in the chat. Thank you, Chris.
Can you kindly repeat the question again, Sarah, please? Kindly repeat again.
Yes. Was it ethical that the community development worker didn't close the WhatsApp group when her manager asked her to do so. So was it ethical, unethical, or it depends? Okay, so I'm just going to move back on the chat. So we've got quite a few depends, but Chris, thank you very much for coming out clearly to say you thought it was ethical. Are you able to put your mic on and say why you voted for it to be ethical?
Okay, hi everybody. The reason why I thought it was ethical, because we had similar situation over COVID with us, is that because service offices closed down, because staff were infected and people needed to access information, they needed support, they needed information. I established various WhatsApp groups. And people had the option, if they don't want to be part of it, to exit, but most of the people stayed. And it became such a lively sharing of information that it actually became the mainstay for many people who were in very isolated, difficult situations in very remote areas, because through that, they felt they were part of a community, they were connected, and it helped them to cope with the isolation of being in quarantine, being in self-isolation, being infected, and it helped people to go across. So for me, if you shut that down, immediately you cut people off, and community development is about the people, not about us. And for me, what was the greater good for the people, and that was for them to have this lifeline during this period. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And I see, Anna, you've said it was ethical. Would you very briefly like to add anything to what Chris has said?
Despite appreciating the it depends reasons, I was trying to go with gut, if not be slightly provocative. And I think the greater good argument is just, again, some personal experiences with colleagues who were doing extraordinary work, got shut down because they weren't abiding by every single rule, and the suicide death rates went through the roof of their substance misusers, and they just felt in desperate circumstances, we're going to do whatever we need to do. It was messy, it wasn't neat around the edges, I'm sure there'll be all sorts of repercussions in retrospect, but it felt like a lifeline that even was trumped all the public health concerns. So controversial, but push comes to shove, ethical.
Thank you. I don't think anybody has said it was unethical, but we've got lots of it depends. Okay, so I can see Claire, you said it depends. What would it depend on for you?
For me, it's about the consent of the folk in the group, and that if they're happy to be in that group and they're happy to self-regulate, then that's fantastic. But you know, sometimes folk can add people in a WhatsApp group they've not actually thought about the circumstances that those people live in individually. But I have seen that kind of informal connectivity working brilliantly as well. So, but for me, it was about the safety of people in the group.
Yeah, okay. Any of the other people who said it depends would like to add any points to that? Just wave your hand and put your mic on. Yes, so we've got Dominique.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think what's ethical can really change over time. That's the beauty of the dilemma here. It might have been very ethical in the beginning to open that group and have the immediate need of the group in mind, but maybe over time it's also ethical to then have a discussion with those people in the WhatsApp group about the implications of this group, and maybe also have a discussion with the organization or the manager about their concerns, why they want the group shut down, and then move on from there, recognizing that any immediate action was just necessary to be taken by the worker. But ethics here might really require a dialogue first and foremost, which is always a dilemma because the pressure is so high to take action. But probably as time moves on, it's ethical to have that dialogue and go for it.
Thank you. Emma.
I agree with Dominique, and I'll build on that a little bit just to say that I think it would be a a challenge for the nonprofit organization if more work was being done to connect the members of the organization, and if this WhatsApp group took away from or diluted or confused the other ways in which members could be connecting and communicating at that time. So if it's adding to the clutter and to the crowd of the initial wave of trying to connect through COVID, and the organization wanted to take a more streamlined approach to ensure that everyone, even folks that didn't perhaps have access to WhatsApp, could be connected and doing that way, I think that would be important to take into consideration as well.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything that hasn't already been mentioned?
Yeah, Sarah, I would like to add.
Yeah.
So what happened particularly here in India was that, there was no regulation on the WhatsApp group, right? So there were a lot of fake news going around. So that became a problem, right? So when we were saying that these WhatsApp groups became support groups, which is good. So finally, we had to set up a help desk to take care of fake news. And these kind of groups became, what should I say, like super spreaders of COVID. They became super spreaders of fake news, thinking that if this news was shared on this WhatsApp group, which has been created by the organization, all the updates that were coming in it were checked for. So that became a challenge, right? Yeah. So because there was no check.
Yep, that's a really important point, Sonia, and that's one of the issues across the world with WhatsApp, and I think particularly it had a big effect in India and even in the UK. So we don't know the reason the manager said the WhatsApp wasn't okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking, whether the purpose of the WhatsApp group was not being met. So lots of groups had to be changed to only admins for posting.
Yeah.
So they did not remain support groups after that, right? It's like us on this group and only you posting. So we lost the purpose of member engagement.
Yeah, so it becomes a really difficult dilemma then, doesn't it? Between wanting to stop the fake news and the serious damage that can happen as a result of that, because it goes sort of viral on WhatsApp and many other, because if they're closed groups, nobody can see them. You can't even counteract them, whereas on Twitter, perhaps you could counteract some fake news. So it becomes a really difficult issue, as well as the issue to sort of consent and safety. As you say, people can leave the groups, so it's probably less problematic than in some social media. Yeah, so that was interesting. So by talking together, we've had quite a range of views, which has probably helped us think through some of the issues that maybe we ourselves hadn't thought of. And that's the sort of the aim of having these short vignettes. Is everybody able to see the chat? If anybody can't see the chat, let me know. Hopefully everybody can see it, because the second vignette in there. But what I think I'm going to do now is to break you up into small groups. So I'm going to show you a few more things on screen while I ask Nargis to divide people into small groups. And I think we could have 5 groups, and obviously you could keep the tech support. Keep one group in the main room with me, so we would actually have 4 groups with one group left in the main meeting room, because then we could carry on with the recording as long as people are happy with being recorded. So if you could be setting up in effect 5 groups, but one of which would be in the main meeting room with me, that would be good. And I'll just quickly share the screen again to prepare us. So the next one, which I've also put in the chat, and I'll put more things in the chat because hopefully the chat follows you to your groups, was just a simple case again in COVID-19, Hong Kong. The manager of a domestic violence project realised some women were not seeking admission to the shelter run by the project because of strict disease control policies, including not allowing residents to go outside. That may be familiar to you. In the early days of lockdown in many countries, in residential settings, people were actually not allowed to go outside, even to go shopping. The manager decided to relax this policy because obviously she was concerned that people weren't who needed to come, because we also know that cases of domestic violence rose during the pandemic. She decided to relax the policy. Was this decision ethical, unethical? It depends on. And I'm going to ask you to discuss that amongst yourselves in the groups. Now you know how to go about it. We've now got a longer vignette, which you may or may not get time to look at, and I will cut and paste this in the chat before you move rooms, which is based in Tamil Nadu, India. It's come from Pradeep Narayanan, who works for Praxis in India. And this was a project working in manufacturing districts, and the aim was to raise awareness of workers' rights and poor working conditions. And the way the NGO worked was through establishing village tuition centres for children as a way of building trust and reaching the garment worker families. But the work was complicated by the caste system, involving segregation and observation of various customs, and the Dalit communities at the bottom of the hierarchy were facing the worst forms of discrimination. The community development team and the local community support group had to decide where to place the tuition centre in a village which comprised 3 hamlets. This is where it gets complex, but ethics is complex. Hamlet A had about 80 families from the so-called highest caste, with 27 garment workers. Hamlet B, 100 families from the so-called middle caste, with 35 garment workers. And Hamlet C was a Dalit colony with 95 families with 18 garment workers. And the background we need to know is that if children from the Dalit hamlet enter another higher caste settlement, they have to remove their slippers. If children from the higher caste settlements enter Dalit hamlets, their families risk social boycotting by members of their own caste. The CD team and community support group decide to locate the centre in Hamlet B because it has the most garment workers and will have the greatest impact on the funders' target criteria. Was this decision ethical, unethical? It depends on. Quite difficult for us to know when we're not located in or familiar with India, but I'd like you to have a look at that one. And there is a second part to that, which I'll put in the chat for you to have a look at when you're ready. So I'm just going to place this stuff in the chat. I've put one there. I'm going to put this second one in there. It'll just take me a minute or two, and then we'll see if we can go into the breakout rooms.
I'm sorry. How should I divide the participants into groups?
It can be random.
Random, okay.
But if you do a random selection, if you make 5 groups with a random selection, okay, and then pull about 5 people, pull one person out of each group and put them into the, not in a group, in the main meeting room with me. Are you able to do that?
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
See if you can. While I'm just putting these into the chat. And I'll ask you not particularly to read the next phase of vignette 3 yet. You can look at that when you've had a look at phase 1. I've now gone and lost something. Okay. I've just done something which has here we are. Which is when I lost you all. This is what happens, isn't it, when we're clicking and on Zoom. Okay, I'm just going to finish this off, and then we'll get into groups. And you might also, if you want, share in the groups your own any experiences of your own. So if you feel you've had enough of looking at vignettes, then please feel free to share what you think are the main ethical issues in community development work, and perhaps share some of your own examples. So what I'd like you to do when you get into the groups should have about 5 people in them. I think we've already lost some people anyway. appoint one person to act as facilitator, just so you've got someone to make sure things are moving along and to check out if everybody's okay and what you would like to do, if you want to work on the first vignette or the second one, or if you want to discuss a little bit about your own dilemmas. And if you've got, we just have about 20 minutes in those groups, so you won't be able to do everything. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. I won't say a time because there's too many different time zones on the go. So have you got the breakout groups ready?
Yes,
If
our
so,
group's ready.
You could then open the breakout rooms, and then if you go into the breakout rooms, and if you could close the breakout rooms, or I can probably do that, I'm not sure, but if you could close them in 20 minutes time, that would be good. So what we'll do is take a little bit of feedback from you in terms of what you did discuss, and if any individuals would like to share anything that you've been thinking about in terms of the ethical challenges for community development workers and any of your own experiences. So those of you who remember what group you were in, anybody remember being in group 1, I would like to make any comments about what you discussed in that group.
Sarah, Dominic here. I think I was in group 1 together with Anna, who is not back yet.
Okay.
So I can just very briefly say what we discussed. We briefly talked about the main ethical challenges in community development work, and we really looked at the pandemic and the questions of, do the means justify the end? And then we exchanged on a few, I would say, clear examples from our work where we saw how, for instance, in my context, persons with disabilities were deprioritized from responses, public health responses to the pandemic, with the so-called justification that was too complex to deal with their special needs. And Anna also shared examples from her end, and we were just getting into the discussion, and then we got
okay. Nargis, I guess it's too complicated to recreate the breakout groups, because if we've now rejoined the meeting, the breakout groups probably don't exist from before, do they?
Hi folks, sorry, I ended up in 2 different rooms. I don't know what I was doing. So sorry. In the middle of this brilliant conversation with colleagues, and the next thing I knew, I was away.
Yes, we've all had the experience. Okay, I was just trying to see if we could get back in, but I don't know that we can. Thank you very much for that, Dominic. So it sounds, although you only just got started, you did have some quite useful discussions,
Yeah,
particularly relating to people with disabilities. Yeah, thank you. Anybody remember being in group 2?
Yes, Monica here. I think I was in group 2 with Karen and Lisa and Chris, and we started discussing the scenario in Hong Kong. And it was difficult, but in the end, we thought it was for various reasons unethical, not only because of the COVID situation that somebody could bring in the virus, but also because of security issues in the shelter. So that's in a nutshell. If anybody else would like to join, to add.
Yeah, we felt that while we started out saying that it depends, we were sort of drawn to actually it was unethical. And one of the things we raised was that there were probably other ways that the shelter could have gone about making the space welcoming and increasing the opportunity for women to come to the shelter, including, for example, allowing her to bring her children along, things like that, that might have encouraged more. We didn't feel like the lockdown itself, which was a lockdown everybody was experiencing, was eliminating that lockdown. There should have been other strategies that they could have looked at.
Okay, thank you. Group 3. Anybody remembers being in that group? You don't always pay attention to what breakout group number you joined, do you? Anybody remember being in group 4?
Yes. Group 4. We were group 4.
We were group 3, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So group 3.
Okay, go ahead, group 3.
Okay, for us, we looked at the question on the shelter, and we were really torn. To some extent, we felt it was ethical because of the COVID cases were on the rise, and the cases of death, and also at the same time the domestic violence cases were on the rise. And from the people that were in that group, Claire, Emma, in all our countries, the cases of gender-based violence were really high. And for example, in Kenya, like we had so many teenage pregnancy cases that were reported. And so we felt there were so many other ways that we would have dealt with these cases. And even the shelter would have probably had different structures on dealing with these issues. So we were really torn between whether it was ethical or yeah.
Okay, that sounds like you had a very interesting discussion, and that was enlightened by your own experiences in each country, where it's interesting, it's sad that across the world domestic violence cases were rising, weren't they? And at the same time, some shelters were having reduced numbers coming in because of social distancing. So it was a really challenging time. Thank you for that. And then Sonia, group 4.
So group 4, we were just 2 of us initially.
Oh.
And we actually chatted about India. And then Erin joined us, but Erin had not attended your session. So we kind of gave her a brief on what your session was about. And we started reading the problem on the shelters. And when we were just about to start discussing, it was over. We didn't really get anywhere.
Okay.
So Erin, I think you'll get more insights now while we're all discussing.
Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone for going with those breakout groups and being forced to leave them prematurely. So these just are some of the issues that we face, but it does sound like you had some worthwhile discussions, hopefully. And the idea of those shorter vignettes, as I said, was just to get you talking. And often it's quite frustrating because you think, well, I don't know all the details. I don't know what it was like in Hong Kong. We don't know how many other shelters there were, etc. But it's interesting, isn't it? Once you get going, it's a great stimulus for discussion. So that's quite nice to use, as I say, with students, because they can be easily read because they're short. The one from India that you didn't get onto, of course, was much longer and much more complex, but that does represent some of the rather challenging decisions that community development workers are having to work with community partners to take. And I guess that what that community development team there was facing was a genuine dilemma, because a dilemma is where actually you're torn between one action and another action, and they both have equally difficult or challenging consequences. So wherever you place the tuition centre, somebody's going to be excluded. So you try to be more inclusive, then someone else is going to lose out. So how do you work it? And that does require quite a lot of debate. And it's interesting that the original shelter, the original school was placed in the hamlet which had the most garment workers, but was most detrimental to the people from the Dalit community. And the community support group had gone ahead with that. And it wasn't until a new NGO came in and looked harder at all the consequences that they started to see, well, this is actually perpetuating discrimination. Oughtn't we to be challenging it? And that comes back to a comment that was made earlier about how far do you go to challenge the status quo, and the fact that some of the people from the Dalit community had got used to tackling issues when they were ready, and not wanting outsiders to make an issue start before they were ready. So a whole host of issues coming in there. And I was asking you to look at that one in terms of the threefold discussion framework, which was looking at ethical vigilance. What are the issues there? What might be some of the hidden issues? And in this case, some issues were exposed later on. As somebody mentioned, things change over time, and we see new issues as things proceed. We may have to then change our original decision. And the logistics comes into that one quite a lot, because there was actually apparently a common area where some shops were, but they couldn't afford to place the tuition centre in that area. So they had to work out what the best thing was to do. In the short time that we have left, and you're probably all pretty tired if you've been at this conference the whole day, so we don't have to go right to the end. Do feel free to leave when you would like to. We could perhaps very quickly share any of your thoughts about what you see are the main ethical challenges facing community development workers today, and if there's any that you would like to add, or you'd like to sort of reframe according to what's going on in your own country. So has anybody got anything they'd like to share on what you think are the major ethical challenges facing community development workers today?
Sarah,
Yeah.
can I come in? So from an Irish perspective, I have experienced in practice a non-practice manager or management structure. So people that maybe don't have a community development background, being in charge. And just that first vignette that you shared around somebody else making a decision, then that influences how you do your work. And if you disagree with that, how do you stay true to the values of community development and not get fired, I guess. And then equally that extends beyond that then, some of the requirements of funders where we have bureaucrats dictating, outcomes of projects or work or whatever, and increasingly individualizing the work of community development. So how do you push back but remain employed in that space for practitioners or our students going forward?
Yeah. Yep, I think those are very difficult challenges, and which people would probably find quite common across the world. Did somebody else have their hand up or want to add? Donna, are you raising your hand?
Yes, sorry, Sarah. Just to say, I really enjoyed your presentation, and Sharon and my colleagues. I just wanted to say I find it very difficult in terms of my work, where I'm working with people who are very lonely and very depressed. And when they want you to move outside the boundaries of what you need to do for them, so when they want you to ring up in Northern Ireland, it'll obviously be jobs and benefits office, because someone has messed up their money and they don't have any that week. And where I'm telling my staff as a manager, you can do A, B, and C, but you can't do D and F. And then they're saying, well, such and such hasn't got food for their family. And I find that very difficult. And I don't know about other people, but particularly during COVID and now sort of moving to a new normal, whatever that may look like, I think it's very difficult to stay within the boundaries of your job parameters.
Yes, I think that is another very important challenge, isn't it? Anybody else want to add anything?
I think I'll say in many cases, community development work is not looked as professional work. Many people just think it's, just a lot of volunteer, you just giving your time, and you can, like Donna has said, no boundaries. I think there's a lot of that, though with time it's changing. But I feel for a long time people have not looked at community development as a professional field.
Yeah, that is another issue. How does the profession or the occupation gain strength and credibility? Any other points? Okay, well, I think it's been a long day, and you have done extremely well. Because this session, for some reason, I thought that there was supposed to be 70 minutes, but this session was an hour and a half. So we got lucky in having this final session. So I would like to thank you all very, very much indeed for staying with it, and for suffering Zoom and some of my incompetencies as well. It's been great to hear from you, and to share some ideas and thinking. And it's an ongoing process, I think. I mean, there are no easy answers, but it's important to take time to stop, reflect, and above all, reflect with colleagues. So some of these challenges about non-community development managers and having to conform to bureaucrats, it's so important that we belong to professional and occupational groups, that we have peers, which was mentioned in the earlier plenary talk, and we gain support from each other, and solidarity with the communities that we're working with, and with each other, and find opportunities to stop and reflect and talk. And I think during the pandemic, particularly when people have been working from home, they've not been able to go into offices or centres, they've been very isolated, and you've missed that peer support, which is absolutely vital to keep us going and to bounce ideas off when we're trying to decide what to do in a new circumstance. So that's really important, and to remind ourselves of the community development values, that we are there in fact to enable people to work for social change. And the pandemic has thrown up the worst sort of inequities that we've known have been there all the time, but they've been more exposed and they've been exacerbated. So never has there been a time when community development is more necessary, because a lot of the solutions have to lie in communities, also challenging governments and NGOs to provide the needed support, but above all to be able to take collective action to work on COVID-19, the climate crisis, and all the other issues that are coming up. So I can see we've got a hand up there. Lisa, did you want to add something?
I actually wanted to ask a question, if that is okay.
In
connection to what Mudhoni just said, I have been thinking about something, and it's also in connection to what was discussed a bit like towards the beginning of the session. So in the context of the institution I am working for, and I work for ICRAF, which is a big international research organization with a clear mission in terms of sustainable land use, what I notice is that the more the institution takes on a real livelihoods focus, and the more biophysical scientists warm up to the idea that land use is improved through working with people in a dignifying way, the more all these concepts come up. So we have a lot of talk these days in the institution about transformational change. We have very strong focus on gender. All projects need to be gender sensitive, gender inclusive, gender transformative. So we are moving through these phases where very strong ethical issues are being addressed, while I feel that people very often lack the reflection and the training. So in connection to what Mudhoni is saying, very often I get the sense that people think working with people is what you do as a by the way, as opposed to intentionally. And therefore people very often lack the ethics and really lack this, like, the means for dignifying communication. And people very often don't mean ill. Like, I very often do think that people don't mean ill. But then also comes up this idea of supposedly universal values. And I really struggle with this idea of like a separate, I think it's very important, especially like as a white person, like operating in a space like here, it's very important to be very clear about the boundaries between ethics and values, because values are so informed by context. And what I see so very often is, especially with like the foreign scientists working in these spaces that don't necessarily have social science training, that they come with ideas that are totally unacceptable. I find it like they come with methods that are totally unacceptable. They come with ideas that are totally unacceptable. And I find it absolutely incredible to walk into a community that you don't know, people don't know you, and then you want to start talking about, I don't know, gender-based violence, and you want to bring people together, have a theater piece that have never seen you and that you have never seen before within half an hour, because after half an hour you have to drive back out in your big car, because you somehow now notice that it's important to work with people to affect behavior change. So like my question basically is, do you have any recommendation of an easy to read think piece that I could give to people like that. Because what I face very often, and I assume that we might all be in these spaces, unless we work like in an institution where we're all like-minded, which unfortunately doesn't happen very often. But what I very often notice is that if I am trying to even say something, will very easily be branded as, you know, like arrogant, and now that there come these people again who understand people better than we do. And it's very complicated sometimes to have a meaningful communication interaction with someone in the institution towards growing understanding that will not be perceived as offensive. But I really do think that if you witness someone behaving like this in an institution that you work in, I really think we have to learn how to be those people who step up. But how do we step up in a meaningful way that is solution oriented? Do we have a piece of solution, please?
Right. Well, I think I'm sure there's some people in the group here who may have some pieces of solution. I'm looking. Claire doesn't know. I'm looking at her, for example, to knowing that in Scotland they've actually got a code of ethics, which is not everybody's bag, but at least it lays out clearly what the values are and what community development workers should and shouldn't do in the Scottish context, but not necessarily everywhere else. And also I think the publications of the IACD, of course, which are relatively straightforward, saying what is community development, how should we approach it, how can we respect people we work with. So I think there's probably quite a lot of things around about. A lot of them we know of at more academic textbooks, which wouldn't be so good. But anybody like to volunteer any materials to Lisa that might help her with some of these outsiders, scientists coming in?
Just like to add on to that. So like within the organization, we do work on these things, right? So we produce our own stuff, but very often I notice that it's just, I think it's somehow also because it comes from within the institution. So sometimes people, there's a lot of resistance to change. While we think we are change makers, we walk into a community for half an hour and we affect change. But it's very complicated for an institution to change, especially if like people who represent like old school streams within the institution feel threatened by people coming up with other stuff. So literally what I'm looking at is not a very complex like theoretical piece, but more like something very simple that is non-offensive, but very sensible. You know, like almost something that you could share as a Facebook post. Thank you. If anyone has any ideas, I'll be very happy to receive them. Thank you.
The Scottish Community Development Centre have a great film, which is like a minute long, explaining what community development is. If I can find that, I'll pop it up.
Thanks, Claire. Well, this could be a challenge for IACD actually to produce something that fits your bill, but it probably needs tailoring to your circumstances. And of course, it's a long, slow process of kind of, we don't want to sound too patronizing, but of education, isn't it? Of gradually seeding ideas and modeling good practice and challenging gently, but not easy at all. Okay, well, before Lisa asked that big question, I was about to say we could leave for the day. And so I'm going to say we can draw this to a close now. And to repeat that I'd like to thank you all very, very much indeed. I'll be around for a few more minutes if anybody wants to carry on talking, but otherwise please go and have a break. And I believe there is a networking session coming up later if anybody has any energy left, but I'm not quite sure how we'll do the networking if we're not in breakout groups. Who knows how we'll do the networking, but we can look at each other's pictures on Zoom. So thank you. Have a good rest of day, evening, morning, whatever it is for you, and may see some of you later or tomorrow. So thanks very much, and thanks.
Thank you.
Very well.
Right. Thanks, Sarah.
Bye. Thank you.
Well done, everyone.
Sharing.
Wonderful. So on behalf of the team that was here, we want to take this opportunity and express our sincere gratitude and thanks to Sarah Banks for that well-informed presentation. Some of us here have never thought about ethics in community development in a deeper way as she did. So she has done it so well, challenged us and provoked our thought process. And I think we are going to learn much more, and there is much more that we'll also be able to disseminate to others. So Sarah, thank you so very much for that. And thank you participants for the time and to be here with us. So enjoy yourselves until we meet again. Cheers and bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.